what's up, everybody? My name is Sean Vaughn, and welcome to Champions Material. Glad to be here. Appreciate everyone who tuned into last week's episode, The Replayables. Appreciate the love, feedback, everything. Continue to like, subscribe, and share. Let's see where this thing can go. Throughout all Champions Material podcasts, we'll be introducing the topics we'll be diving into up front. So as they're being discussed throughout the pod, it gives you, the listener, the opportunity to think, form your ideas or perspective. And if there's questions, thoughts, any feedback you want to submit, shoot those over to us at champions.materialsv@gmail.com. Again, that's champions.materialsv@gmail.com. Or leave a voicemail. Tell us what you think. The link is located at the bottom of the description for this episode. We want them. It can only help grow the podcast, make it better. Now, the title we'll dive into this week is Marvel Villains. And we'll focus not necessarily on their powers or their battles with our favorite Marvel superheroes. Instead, we'll focus on their backstories, their ideologies. In other words, why did they do what they did? What was the driving force behind their actions? Then we'll get into the best of what we've seen in the recent run of movies involving the X-Men and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, M.C.U. Now, with me today to dive into all this and more, I've known this guy for a long time, and we've had our debates seemingly about almost everything. My good friend from the Villains and Vinyl podcast, my man CJ. What's up, brother? Welcome to Champions Material, man.
Hey, man, thanks for having me, man. I'm humbled to be here. I'm ready to get into this, talk about these villains. This is right up my alley right here.
All right, here we go. Here we go. So let's go ahead and highlight the topics we're going to discuss and then get into it. Food for thought. Is there a character in the Marvel universe who's considered to be a villain, but who in your eyes is actually a hero? Thanos. Now, we're going to provide our take on how Thanos was presented in the MCU. What, if anything, would we change? And finally, the best of the MCU. Beginning with Iron Man, the MCU has had plenty of movies with plenty of highlights. CJ and I are going to give you our best of the best from the MCU. So let's go ahead and get this thing started, man. Food for thought. CJ, I'm going to kick this to you to start it off. Is there a character in the Marvel Universe who is generally considered to be a villain, but in your eyes is actually a hero?
I would have to say no, because when I thought about this question, you gave me this question earlier in the week, right? There are a lot of villains whose philosophy I don't necessarily disagree with. I don't necessarily think they're wrong. However, once they start going about their actions, that's where I have a problem with them, from their actions. Their philosophy, for example, Killmonger is one that's always tossed about with a philosophy that you can understand his viewpoint on, but the actions themselves are, non-redeemable, things of that nature. Or let me not say non-redeemable, but they're just not cool. Ghost and Ant-Man and the Wasp, she was just trying to live, right? But the actions make that there. And then, so Helena, so all these people, while I might agree with their philosophy, or they might have a point that I can understand their logic, once you get into the actions, that's when I can't rightfully be like, oh man, no, you're really a hero. No, you're not.
Word.
You're not. But I see your point, so that's for me.
You know what, man? You just touched on something that I hadn't really necessarily considered when, we were coming up with this question, and it was separating the ideology and understanding where they're coming from their actions. And that's a good point. I think that's a great point. I think we have plenty of air quotes villains that if you just remove their actions from what we've seen, either, on film or even taking it deeper into the comic books, you can look at them and say, I completely understand where you're coming from. And to your point, I'm going to take a minute and step away from the MCU side of things and shift over into the X-Men side of things, and particularly Magneto, who I've always found to be fascinating when you're talking about his backstory and where his ideology comes from. You're talking about a guy who's been oppressed and dealt with racism from the very beginning. He literally watched his family die in a concentration camp based solely on just who they are, who they were. He then, as he's coming up, discovers his mutant, gifts and his mutant abilities, and he sees that he's now being oppressed based on being a mutant. So he's been oppressed and dealt with racism based on who he was as a person. And then he's also being oppressed and stereotyped based on the fact that he was a mutant. He then meets Charles Xavier, who, if you want to talk about a textbook definition of an individual that is informed enough, but also has a personality to be able to go out and try to, in a peaceful way, appeal to humans and say, look, we don't want any special privileges. We don't want to be seen. We're not saying that we're better than you. We just want to be heard. Sit down with us, have an open mind, listen to where we're coming from, and we want to listen to where you're coming from. And he's just seeing Charles being completely just shut down, being also oppressed when he is trying to go about this in a peaceful manner. Okay, so now you combine that with his life experiences, and I can absolutely understand where he's coming from. But as you mentioned earlier, it's understanding and being able to sympathize with what got them to that point, what got Magneto to the point where he said, you know what, we're just going to wipe out the entire human race. You know, can't go there, right? So the actions, X-Men 2, when he's willing to wipe out the entire human race, X-Men Days of Future Past, where he is literally looking to assassinate the president to start basically a race war or a human mutant war that he feels that the mutants can win because he understands what happens in the future where the Sentinels created by humans is pretty much wiping out the entire mutant race, right? His actions cross the line. But as far as understanding where he's coming from, I can absolutely do that. So being able to separate the two, sympathizing and understanding where they're coming from versus the actions that they're willing to take in order to get to what their end game is, so to speak, are two separate things, but you need to have, so you're having two separate conversations when you're trying to break down whether or not these individuals are true villains or do their actions make them villains. So I thought that was a good point on your end.
Like you've always seen those interviews where they talked about particularly Magneto and Charles, how a lot of writers drew. I think even Stan Lee said he drew inspiration from the Malcolm and Martin debate
Yes.
of ideology, right? So you can
No
definitely
doubt.
understand what's going on here. But like you said, when you're trying to wipe out a whole race, while I'm not saying I don't disagree with it, like I'm not saying I don't get his logic. I'm not saying he's wrong for his. Well, he's wrong, but I'm not saying I don't understand it. At least let me put it like that. Like
Yeah, yeah,
I understand the anger in which that comes from.
exactly.
So I can get it, but you can't do it, man. Like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can't. So
yeah, man. And no, yeah, good point there. And that's my thing, So they're all technically villains, but I think most, if you're considered a villain in the Marvel, universe, we're talking X-Men, period. Based on your actions, most likely, yeah, you use a damn villain. Come on now, you're crossing lines that cannot be justified. But as far as understanding what where you're coming from and understanding what got you to that point where you felt like that was your option, plenty of individuals that you would, air quotes, label as a villain are not.
oh
Um,
yeah.
and Killmonger, by the way, great example. You saw what happened to him, as a youngin. So yeah, although his actions were were you can't justify them, I know for damn sure from the very beginning I was like, hey, I understand. I understand where you're coming from. I understand
Yeah.
how he feels. So yeah, man, that's a good point on your part for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, to be fair, I think some people need to have that same viewpoint about heroes because there are a lot of heroes who do wrong things for the right reasons, right? Like, and we let them slide because we feel like, oh, well, you're saving the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I get where you're coming from, but no, man, you just crossed a serious freaking line, like to
Right, right.
do it. Like, so, I mean, that's the thing. Any good comic book is gonna frame both the heroes and villains usually the best of the best comic books are going to frame them both in shades of gray, right?
Exactly.
There's very few, maybe your Supermans and stuff where it's black and white sometimes, but for the most part, it's always morally gray. Of well, yeah, this villain is wrong, but to catch him, you had to, beat up 15 goons' necks and break their necks and put them in the hospital.
Right, right.
So
In the
yeah, I get it.
ICU. Yeah. Yeah, man. And I think it's a complicated. The reason why I wanted to really dive in because it seems like, and to your point a moment ago, when you ask the question, it seems like it's a black and white question. Okay, if you're considered a villain, you are a villain. But then when you bring frankly, just the morality and the ability to understand and empathize with where they're coming from, they're in their mind and their heart, they're not. It's when their actions cross that line. So, it's a question that I think we can all, ask ourselves as just people in general. Like, okay, do we have certain actions at times? I'm not an angel. There's been a couple of occasions in my life where it was a couple of things where I knew, like, okay, black and white, that was wrong. But based on where I was coming from and what had happened to get me there, I justified it and wouldn't do it, wouldn't do it differently if I was put in that same situation again. So, just big picture, don't judge. If you don't know a person's full story, if you don't know the full context of what's going on, don't judge a person's actions. If you go strictly off of their actions, okay, if you want to make it black and white, fine. But if you don't really understand the full backstory of what's going on, stay in your lane, chill out.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair to a point, but I would say none of your actions were. I feel safe to say none of your actions were mass genocide. You know what I mean? Like none of your. So I can understand that, but none of your actions where you wasn't trying to kill like hundreds of millions of people.
People,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
on that one, I can get where you still agree with their philosophy, which you're like, nah, man, you're kind of a crappy person. I'm gonna have to judge you on that because you took it to,
Like
to the south.
we can't sit down over a drink and discuss this and have me get to a point where you go, you know what? Yeah, it was over 150,000, when you blew up that factory. But now that you explained it, I'm with
Like,
you. No, that's not gonna
yeah,
happen.
now that you explain your war against capitalism, I'm all with you, bro. Like, so I get it.
Yeah, man, it's a complicated question, man. And actually, we're gonna go ahead and stay with that theme as we move on to our second topic. And our second topic, you know, this gentleman was just, or however you want to call him, this villain, probably more accurate description. Thanos, Infinity War as well as Endgame. If you go strictly off of how he was presented in the MCU, if we go into the comic realm and everything he did there and being obsessed with death, that's a whole nother conversation. So we're going to keep it strictly within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If you're taking everything into account, and I think I have an idea where you're going based on what we just wrapped on. Thanos, you consider him to be a villain, but do you understand where he was coming from as he was presented in the MCU? What was your take on Thanos just in general?
Oh yeah, his philosophy. Uh, Part of his philosophy. Let me say that. Part of his philosophy was absolutely not wrong, right?
Right.
He knew there's a finite amount of resources in the universe. And you also got to think about him from his perspective, right? Think about we've seen that kind of situation on a very limited, small scale kind of play out here on Earth. So
Mm.
imagine somebody
Mm.
who's seen that on every freaking like every freaking planet where there's life. So to him it's a repeatable problem that keeps happening where there's finite resources and we're overcrowding
Right.
ourselves and we're using up those resources. So that I completely probably can understand. Like there's finite resources, we're overcrowded, we have to do something about it, right? So he has this. He goes about this mission to get this powerful thing that can help undo that. Fair enough. Maybe not agree with some of his decisions along the way, but on the universal scale, when everything's in the balance, hey, I get if you feel like this is the only option. Maybe you're a little bit militant, although you probably could have asked people for help without murdering them.
Just
You
just
could
a
have,
thought.
but fair enough. my issue becomes once he gets the affinity stones and everything. This is my biggest issue out of all of that is you could have just created more resources, right?
Yes.
Like if you have this infinite power, because he did it again to create a whole planet in Endgame, right? So he could have, I don't know. I would imagine it would take just as much energy to create maybe double the resources as it would be to take away half of life throughout the universe. So
Right.
I would imagine it's about the same level of energy to where you could take the snap. So to me, that's where kind of the Mad Titan, which is kind of, if you follow the comics, is kind of his nickname
Exactly.
in the comics. That's where the Mad Titan part comes in, of where his point has a kernel of truth to it, but once he starts getting into his actions and getting warped with it, it was like, well, no. Particularly with the MCU, you could have just created more resources. Like you didn't have to take away half of the universe. So that's kind of where I fall with him. Where I get I get at least part of his philosophy, because a part of his philosophy makes complete sense. It's just when he goes on a mission and start killing people instead of asking for their help. Because just imagine if he would have asked for help, how much easier this could have gone. And then when he gets it, the only solution he has in his mind is destruction. So, mm,
Exactly. And I'm right there with you, man. His ideology and his thought, that understanding where he was coming from, I get it. The way he went about it without seeking any other, as it was depicted, in the two movies, there was never any seeking of an alternative route other than that. I think, and if I'm being totally honest, and particularly with his interactions with Gamora, and particularly in Infinity War, you saw the Mad Titan come out. You saw where in his mind he wanted to tell himself that he was doing this for the good of all the universe, and that he's the only one, as he said, not if he wasn't smart enough, at least smart enough to act on it and do what he needed to do. But when you saw, particularly the first interaction with Gamora, when she tried to take him out, and he eventually took her back to Titan, you saw the way he, basically said, "Now I can create, basically what anything that I want, or any, scenario that I want." And you saw where that power came in. So he was telling himself, at least my take on it, is that he was telling himself that he was doing this ultimately for a greater cause. But you saw an individual who sought power, and he wanted to have the power to literally control half of life and death. And I think that's something that we see in society with people in powerful places. From a PR standpoint, or even they could believe to a certain point in things that they say, as far as these decisions, although harsh, are done for the greater good of these people, or this company, or this, that, and the third. When ultimately, man, you want power, and typically any people who typically are thirsty for power, they want more. They never can get enough. And then all of a sudden, when you don't have any resistance and you become more powerful, and you recognize that you don't have anyone that can truly oppose you if it comes down to it, then all of a sudden your decision making becomes reckless, and you don't consider other alternatives. And Thanos, to me, was the representation of that, within, as it was depicted in the MCU. We know many powerful people in our society, based on the companies they run, or the influence that they have, that make decisions based on control, power, influence, rather than what they are putting out to the public, or putting out to the people, as far as it benefiting all involved. There are other ways, you're choosing not to do them. And so, even if I understand your ideology to begin with, at some point you cross lines, you cross the point of no return. And I think Thanos, clearly was an example of that.
oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think they did a good job of making sure you at least understood him, right? So
Right.
they did a good job of presenting him, particularly because he was the one that was built up to throughout this whole kind of Infinity saga. So I will give credit where I feel credit is due. I think Marvel did a great job of building him up to, when you think about it, we didn't see him for a lot up until Infinity War and Endgame.
Right.
So
Right.
they did a good job of presenting him as this credible threat. And then when you see him, you're like, oh. Okay, and then it doesn't hurt that you have James Brolin, who is a great actor doing his work to
I
where it
underrated actor in my opinion. Yeah.
yeah, brings kind of a gravitas. So I'm with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you know what? You just touched on something I want to tap into just for a moment. Do you agree with, or were you cool with the way that Thanos was kind of presented throughout all the movies leading up to Infinity War as kind of like the shadow that was looming over everything that was happening? Or would you have liked to have seen a little bit more screen time with him leading up to it? Or do you think the way that they were presenting the whole thing, that they did it just right?
I think you could have given him more screen time. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I do like the fact that they did kind of keep him mysterious, right? Because it didn't wear out your attitude, or it didn't wear you out, right? Where
Right,
you weren't Thanos out. Like I was Loki'd out by the time Loki got through everything. I was like, all right, well, yeah, I'm cool. I've seen you enough,
yeah,
Loki. So they didn't do that. So I'm glad with that. I mean, do you think I think they could have done it differently? Yeah, because you have used a little bit more screen time. I don't think that wouldn't have hurt. But I don't think any problem I have with Thanos, I don't think could have been solved by having more screen time up until Infinity Game,
right,
right? I think any issue I had with Thanos, whether I wanted his death, him to be obsessed with death like he was in comics or something like that, I mean, that decision already been made. So I don't
right.
think there's anything wrong with that, but I do think they presented him very well, or at least I think they presented him fine. Could they have done it better? Sure. I mean, everything could be done better, but I think they presented him really well. I don't have a gripe with it. I know some people do, but I don't have a gripe with it.
And neither do I. You know, neither do I. I think that all in all, again, if you want to nitpick, you can pretty much nitpick almost any movie. You can nitpick almost any album. You can nitpick almost anything. But if you just take it for what it is and also understand the setup leading to really those last two. And I know Spider-Man came afterward, but for many people, that was the apex, or that was sort of like the culmination of everything that started with Iron Man. And I think they did overall a good job. I'm much more of a fan of Infinity War than Endgame, but I don't necessarily have major problems with either. Of the two, which one are you more of a fan of? Endgame or Infinity War?
Here's the thing. Here's my. I know you have your
Uh-oh.
controversial opinion about
Uh-oh.
uh, X Men. My controversial MCU opinion is I don't think either movie separately is great.
Mm.
I think them together makes it one hell of a movie, if that makes sense, right?
Yes.
Because if I'm watching just Infinity War, kind of hate some of the pacing is kind of off to me. You miss out on some character moments that they could have had, and then just leaving all the original Avengers alive. I kind of don't like. I get what they're saying. You have to avenge one last time and stuff, but just the randomness of it, I was like, well, it would have at least taken out one of them, but not
Right.
to here nor there. And then in game, the whole time stuff is fun, and the battle in the end gives you a lot of fan moments, from the comics and stuff that you really enjoy. But you get quibble about Captain America and how he ended. Did he was that the right way? But I
Yeah.
feel like together, it's a very satisfying 6 hours for a Marvel comic book nerd. I just think individually, if I had to pick, maybe I would go in game for the fan moments in the battle that are
Yeah.
just awesome, that are set up by Infinity War, or when like Iron Man reunites with Spider Man. Stuff
Yeah.
like that is super cool. So I guess I would go in game, but that's my controversial pick. Like I wouldn't pick either. Like neither one of them are in my top movies. I always combine them together though. So
Got
that's how I do it.
got you. Okay. You know what? That right there is the perfect lead in to our next topic, and that is the best of the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So obviously Iron Man kicks it off, and we understand the importance of Iron Man. You know, so let me just put it this way. I've got mine, but I'm gonna kick it to you, my man, and I'm gonna let you kick this thing off. Your best of the best. You can go your top three. You can do this however you want to do it. Of all the MCU movies, what were the one or few that stood out to you the most, and why?
I'm gonna go Iron Man because I feel like the influence is important. I don't feel like we can temper down how influential Iron Man was
Okay, hold up, time out.
because
Are we? For a second, are we going with Iron Man based more on the importance or on the fact that just flat out as a movie, you know what I mean? It was on
well, I
point.
also think it was enjoyable too because I think Tony Stark. I mean Robert Downey Jr. played that part. So I mean if you're telling me to pick the best of the best, but see I can't deny its influence when I pick my best.
Yes.
You get what I mean? So it's kind of
One of the
hard for me to
factors
turn
that
that.
really matters. You know what I mean? Is
Yeah. So it's
okay.
kind of hard for me to turn it off. But I don't know if I'm speaking objectively, maybe not, but I can't. So this is biased list. So take it
Yes.
as you will. So I'm gonna put Iron Man on there.
Okay.
I'm gonna put Guardians of the Galaxy on there. I feel
Mm,
I had Volume 2. I think I was talking to somebody last week, but the more I thought about it, Guardians of the Galaxy 1 A is just I feel like is as funny as Guardians of the Galaxy 2, but then that influential factor. And I feel like that's important. Like I feel like when I think about my favorite movies of the MCU, how it impacted MCU going forward
mm.
does make a difference to me personally because I feel like with Guardians of the Galaxy, that gave Marvel the confidence to do other kind of offbeat heroes that are not your main main A team kind of A list kind of heroes. So Guardians of the Galaxy. Third would probably be I'm gonna go Black Panther.
Mm.
I like Black Panther. I know some people don't like Black Panther. I enjoyed it. There were some issues. T'Challa was not the least interesting person in his own movie, but that just meant his
Yeah.
cast was super strong. And I would argue that their set design is unmatched,
Mm.
only by maybe Doctor Strange's cinematography in that one scene, which is super dope. So that'll probably be my number 3, and then my number 4, just to give you kind of my top four.
Yes.
I would probably, if I'm pushed to it, I would probably have to go maybe Avengers
Mm.
because seeing them team up for the first time was super fun, and so that would probably be my fourth one. No, I'm sorry, I scratched that. I left out the best movie of them all.
I
Sorry,
was waiting on it. I
it
was
was
waiting
sorry.
for it.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. So I would take Avengers off my list. That's my apologies. Winter Soldier,
Yes.
because I feel like Winter
Yes.
Soldiers is the best MCU movie. Everything taken into account that they have done. So it was high on my list when I saw it, and I haven't seen a movie that would knock it off. I've
Right.
seen some movies come close, maybe Infinity War and Endgame, excuse me, together could maybe give it a run for its money. But outside of that, Winter Soldier is the best MCU movie I've ever saw, in my personal opinion. So that would be my number 4.
Got you. For me, Iron Man 3. I'm going to go. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit you with my top four as well. For the people out there, we definitely want to hear what you think. Again, shoot any ideas about this or your top four, top three, your number one, however you want to do it, to champions.materialsv@gmail.com. Or, as I mentioned before, leave us a voicemail. Let us know what you think. The link is available at the bottom of the description for this episode. So just want the people out there to put their thinking caps on and let us know where they're coming from. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you all think. But for me, I'm going to take it down. I'm going to break it down from 4 to 1. Going to start at number 4 with Iron Man 3. And you hit it. You were on it when you said it. Obviously, Iron Man. It started the whole thing. It set the tone. This importance cannot be, overstated. And the reality is, it was a damn good movie. Let's be clear. All right, it was the introduction to the MCU, and you walked out of that theater saying like, okay, Robert Downey. Was I sure about him being Iron Man? Being Tony going in? Not particularly, but I left knowing like, okay, they got the guy. Like they did it right. He was the elitist. He could play the elitist, smart ass Tony Stark, but also someone that you could empathize with and you could, relate to on certain levels. And so I really do. I really enjoyed the first one, but 3, particularly because in my view, Iron Man 2. If you're going bottom 4 or bottom, MCU's. Iron Man 2 just
Yeah.
it was forgettable. We'll just say that. We'll leave it there. And I thought
Yeah.
that Iron Man 3 really kind of brought it back, coming back from I would say overall general disappointment of 2, Iron Man 3 really, set a tone there. My number 3 would be Black Panther. The set piece, which, the set pieces and just sort of like the presentation, loved it from start to finish. T'Challa, again, he's again, a very forgettable character, but I honestly felt like Killmonger was the star of that show, of that movie. Much like, frankly, if we're going to cross universes here just for a moment, The Dark Knight. We all know Heath Ledger, Joker.
Yep.
I'm not going to say made The Dark Knight, but he is and will always be the first character and person that you think of when you think of that movie. Same thing with Michael B. and how he came through as we talked about before. Clearly, his actions, he was a villain. You know what I mean? Like, you can't be out here robbing banks. You can't be out here, shooting people who's supposed to be your accomplice. Women that's supposed to be your accomplice, and just other things that he clearly did. When he thought he vanquished T'Challa and everything like that. Okay, we can't cross those lines, but he did a great job of being. You could empathize and understand where he was coming from, and I think that your antagonist very often, particularly in action movies, beyond just Marvel, but just action movies in general, really really elevate the quality of that movie overall. Like, as so that as your hero is coming, is going up against someone he or she has to overcome, that person has to be interesting, not just based on their actions, but based on their story. And I thought that they did a great job there of really kind of giving you Killmonger's backstory, not excusing what took place later on as you got more into the film, but understanding what was going on. So definitely give Black Panther my nod. My number 2 is Infinity War. I know that for you, Infinity War and Endgame, if you were to combine them, almost have like a Godfather 1 and then part 2 type of vibe to it, where you just kind of put them together, it would be great. I just liked Infinity War. Just overall, I liked understanding how he was going to be presented in the MCU based on the trailers leading up to it. They did a good job with Thanos finally coming into the light as a shadow that was really, over. It's like the guy that was casting a shadow over all the movies that led up to it. I liked how he was presented. I liked the Gamora Thanos, even though that's not how it happened. We know, but from the comic standpoint, it didn't happen that way. But I do like that they, showed different sides of Thanos
Mm-hmm.
as one who didn't just mindlessly, make this decision and do everything that he had to do in order to obtain the stones. This was someone that, beyond just the thought of it, there was an emotional aspect to him. There was a genuine love for his stepdaughter, but this was a guy that had made up his mind, as we talked about earlier, that there was no other alternative, and he was going to do what he had to do. I felt like in Infinity War in particular, I felt like the way that they had all the action sequences set up, particularly how they had Cap set up in there, I thought was very, very well done. And um, it just, I don't know, it left a bigger impression on me than Endgame. Let's just put it this way. We talked on a previous episode of Champions Material, we talked about replayable, right? Games that can grab you in a way that, for whatever reason, they can grab you in a way that you can come back to them and make time to come back to them. Infinity War is one of only 2 Marvel movies that I will make time to rewatch, even though I've already watched them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that
That's
makes
how much.
complete sense.
Yeah, yeah. So that's how much of a fan I am of Infinity War. And my number 1, and I know how you brought it in at the last minute, is Captain America: Winter Soldier. I believe and I don't believe it's much of a contest. I will entertain conversations from anyone else because everyone obviously has a right to their opinion. And there have been some good, we talked about Guardians of the Galaxy, Thor Ragnarok, honorable mention. There's obviously been some good ones across this last decade or so. I felt like both Spider-Mans overall were very well done. But Captain America Winter Soldier to me was number 1 when I saw it. And actually, in preparing for this pod, I knew, me and you was going to be chopping it up. I actually went back and rewatched The Winter Soldier just the other day. And that movie is what? It's 8 years old now, 7, 8 years old.
Yeah.
What was it? Like 2000, no, actually like 2013, 14, something along those lines. Anyway, it's been a minute since it dropped. And obviously there have been multiple movies to come into the MCU since. I thought it was the best one I had seen at that time, and rewatching it just a few days ago and preparing for this podcast, it's still the best. That's having seen obviously every MCU movie since. Um, I loved this story. I loved obviously it was him, primarily him, Black Widow, Falcon, and Nick Fury, who died but didn't die. Like, just I love the way everything played out. You realize, Bucky's actually winning the soldier, so obviously they're going back and forth. But then eventually he saves his life, meaning Captain America. I just felt like I connected with all the twists and turns that were presented throughout that movie more so than any other MCU movie. Or we were talking about X-Men earlier. Let's be real. Love Days of Future Past, love First Class, love X-Men 2. You cannot, if you're trying to bring them into the MCU and you're trying to stack any one of those three against the very best of the MCU, you're not really having much of a conversation. I've never had anybody say, okay, well, if you put X-Men movies with the MCU, an X-Men movie to me would still be better than everything that came out of the MCU. That's never been a conversation I've had with anybody. You?
No, I mean, I do think you could put some of those movies would land probably in MCU's top 10. I'll make that a controversial statement because I think for as great as movies MCU has put out, they've also kind of put on some stinkers, if we're being honest. Like, if we're gonna keep it real, like, but they put out so much that we kind of let the stinkers slide. But
Right.
like you say, Iron Man 2, come on now.
Yeah, man.
Thor, we talk about Ragnarok. Let's not talk about Thor 1 and 2. There's a
You know
reason
what?
why.
No, let's go there then. Let's go there.
So,
We just gave you our best of the MCU. Let's go ahead and call this the forgettables, right? We're going to go ahead and just drop a topic in there, man. The forgettables. And these are the movies within the MCU. And how many of them has it been? What was it? 20? I mean, it's been over 20, right? So it's impossible not to have a few that, you'll pick up and then easily put right back down and forget about. So we just talked about the best of the MCU. You got a couple and you threw out a few of them that I'm not going to even debate. I don't think anyone would. So what was going on? What do you think was missing from the first two Thors and Iron Man 2? What was missing from those in particular that they just did not stack up against others that have been pretty good?
I have no idea because you know why? I sometimes I say the villain, but Iron Man didn't have a great villain. So,
No,
and it
never,
was still a better
never.
movie. Like, sometimes I don't know, it's just pacing, it's just the story. Like, to me, Age of Ultron is a terrible movie.
Ooh.
Terrible movie. Like, I hate that movie.
Now hold on.
And
It's not. It's now. I've never heard of it being anyone's favorite, but this is the first time where I heard Age of Ultron being terrible.
oh,
Damn.
Age of Ultron is terrible. I don't get why people like. You mean the one where they cause a problem and they solve it? You mean Avengers fixing their own shit, which is basically kind of a theme of a lot of Avengers stuff. If we being honest, like Civil War is just them kind of fighting amongst each other. So yeah, like I didn't like Age of Ultron at all. I thought it was. I mean, technically, Incredible Hulk is an MCU movie. Technically, it is. Technically, it is. I would say Thor once again 1 and 2.
Yeah.
You can't. Captain Marvel wasn't the best movie to me. It wasn't bad. I'm not gonna sit here and I know a lot of people don't like Captain Marvel, so I'm not gonna say it's terrible. So let me leave that off my list.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's it. I like those are really terrible movies where I'm like, you could have kept those. You definitely could have kept. You could have kept Age of Ultron. You should have kept that at the crib. Like that was not my movie. So
Hey, you know what, man? Let me ask you this. You just indirectly stumbled onto something that I think is important. You talked earlier about, and we both talked earlier about Robert Downey Jr. being, whether we were necessarily sure or unsure going in, you watched that first Iron Man. He was like, okay, we're good here. Like this is the guy. Has there been a situation or situations where you feel like the movie would have, because I think we could talk about this in across several mediums as far as as far as movies and genres, where it's not necessarily the pacing or the story or the direction of that took place in the movie. Sometimes you just don't have the right guy. Like for example, you put and I'm not throwing any shade, but you put Will Smith in the Training Day versus Denzel. It's not quite the same movie. It's just not,
Yeah.
right? So I know you talked about Captain Marvel, and I have heard on more than a few occasions. I'm pretty sure you have too. It's out there that Brie Larson as Captain was not a lot of people's first choice. They didn't necessarily vibe with her. I didn't necessarily have a problem with her. I just did not think the movie was great. But has there been occasions where you said, okay, this guy playing this part in the MCU just does not work for me, and that impacted how you felt about the movie versus just the movie itself? This guy or
No,
this girl is not quite getting it done for you.
I mean, I'm gonna say no because even with Brie, it wasn't my first choice. But I think a lot of people let their personal opinion of Brie
Yes.
cloud because I have a personal opinion of Brie, but I don't think that clouds my ability to think she could do the job. So my problem with Captain Marvel has nothing to do with the performances though. Like, so
Right.
I more have a
So
problem
from a
with saying,
casting standpoint, you're good overall
oh
with the cast.
yeah, for most superhero movies, even crossing the aisle to DC, my controversial opinions. I feel like they get the casting right for the most part. There are some exceptions, but all those exceptions I can think of right now off the top of my head are on DC's side and not Marvel's side. I feel like Marvel does a good job of casting. Or I will say there's not
Right.
a movie where I look back and said it was the actor that was the reason why this movie was bad. I feel like maybe
Right.
Whiplash with your boy Mick, maybe that could have been better. That's more of a villain. Or maybe
Yeah. Yeah.
he somebody else could have done him. But even then, I just think that character was wrong. Trying to think on the hero side, I feel like just going up and down the Avengers list, even when they cast it, the only other person I really had not an issue, but a hesitation on was when they casted Doctor Strange, just because I was just
Yeah.
kind of worried. And while I don't necessarily think that movie is great, I think him as Doctor Strange is awesome, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I'm not the biggest fan of Doctor Strange. The movie outside of some of the cinematography is the best you'll see in the MCU, but I think him as a character shines through, and I think that he's going to be probably looking ahead to Phase 4. That his sequel
Mhm.
is probably going to be the most important movie in the MCU going forward.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I can think of. What about you? Because I'm curious to hear that.
No, man. You know what? And I can't think of. Well, Mark Ruffalo. That's my. He
Okay.
always been the one where for that for that role. Even as Hulk was presented, throughout the MCU, that guy just did not work for me. As I can't rock with him. I don't think he did a terrible job, but there were times where it was a bit of overacting for me, and it kind of would wreck the flow a little bit, but never to the point where it's something like that will be a talking point for me after the fact. But he's the only one. Mark is the only one where I would say, okay, let's get somebody else in there. Who I don't know, but let's just get somebody else in there. Let's calm it down a little bit more, straightforward with it, and it would have, I think, helped the flow, particularly in Endgame. His moments, I was like, okay, let's keep it moving, let's keep it pushing here. But that's literally, and that's not really, and again, not that he did a terrible job. I just would have maybe preferred someone else. And that is the one example that I can think of. I think overall they did a good job with the casting. I love Scarlett, love Chris, love Robert, love all of the main principals that you had. Josh Brolin, as you mentioned earlier, a brilliant Thanos. And you can, even though of course it's CG, you can see particularly facially his acting, his nonverbal acting really come through. Like you really could see the nonverbal like vibe that Thanos was clearly intending to, present. And obviously he did the damn thing. So I think to your point overall, Captain Strange, the actor that portrayed him, that for the most part, actually, either you A, didn't have a problem with the casting, or B, there were a handful of examples where the person did a good job and elevated, the
Mm-hmm.
role, and it really contributed to the movie versus it being a situation where the person didn't quite deliver and it helped kind of, it hurt the movie to a degree. So, I mean, just overall, man, I just think that, as we're going into this next phase, but as we wrap up this, initial phase, I think that, X-Men has definitely had more ups and downs, in my opinion, than, the MCU movies that we've seen, even though there's been more MCU movies. But I think overall, good job. I would say there are a couple of great standouts to me. There's only a couple of sort of I'll never watch them again. That's the Captain Marvels. That's Iron Man 2, Thor 1 and 2. Um, Controversial statement. Not the biggest fan of the original Guardians of the Galaxy. Love 2 because 2 is I can sit down at any point. Once I've watched it and I know what's going on, I can double back to it if it's just playing, and I can sit down at any point and hop right in. 1 was really the build up where I really have to be dialed in, and I think they had to do it that way, right? Because
Yeah.
I think we talked before, and I thought you made a great point with Guardians of the Galaxy. Those were the first time where you didn't have a clear, established familiarity with the characters. So you really had to bring them in and introduce them, and particularly into that world, in the MCU. So I understand why 1 played out the way it did, just didn't quite do it for me. But again, you're talking over what, 20 films so far, if I'm not mistaken, and almost all of them have been on point or in a few occasions as we talked about. Great. So yeah, man. Now let me ask you this. And you talked about, the Doctor Strange and what's coming there being the most important. What storylines, not that you know of, but what storylines, if it were up to you, they came to you and said, CJ, all right, we getting ready to crank up this next phase. What movie or character or portrayal you would like to see coming up in a upcoming Marvel film?
Well, see, I hope they're gonna give it to me in Spider-Man 3. I hope
Mm,
they're gonna give it to me. They're
okay.
teasing it, and I hope
Mm,
Spider-Man: The Last Hunt is what I'm waiting on. I'm waiting for Craven. I have been waiting for Craven for over 20 years because he
yes.
is one of my favorite villains. And we just had this conversation earlier on my other podcast. On the other podcast was Spider-Man to me is the second best rogues gallery of villains outside of Batman. I think Batman is
Mm,
1, Spider-Man is 2.
okay.
I'm not gonna give you my top 5. That's behind the point. But yeah, so I think Spider-Man has a wealth of villains that we haven't seen on screen yet.
Yes.
That I would love to see Craven being at the top of that list, and Spider-Man being the last hunt, being such an iconic storyline. I really want to see how they handle it, particularly in the MCU or with that Fox deal. So excuse me, not Craven. Craven is definitely somebody who I am looking forward to, and they kind of teased it at the end of Far From Home with Peter's identity being kind of revealed, and I'm thinking that's where they're going. So that's where I'm hoping. I am hoping above all hope that that's where.
Mm, right, right. And I feel you on that. Now I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction. A few moments ago, we talked about X-Men and the ups and downs of what we've seen as far as the X-Men movies, especially compared to what we've seen out of the MCU. Now, if you want to go technically, one X-Men or X-Men related movie that I thought completely stood out and was completely different from all the rest of them, and it was done purposefully, was Logan, which dropped a few years ago. And as heavy as it was to get to watch from start to finish, it was brilliantly written. And regarding the purpose of how that movie played out, it was done brilliantly. And the thing that I really appreciated about Logan versus the other X-Men movies was that it wasn't a focus on their powers and their abilities, which obviously you saw that throughout in segments, but it was really a story that dealt with the cost, the ultimate cost and price that you have to pay at times for either things that happened to you or decisions that you made along the way. And along those same lines, we talked about Spider Man and the rogues gallery that he has as far as villains that he's faced. One of the more obscure villains is Tombstone. A guy that literally he has superhuman strength. He has sharp teeth, can look like a vampire. You caught him in Spider Into the Spider Verse, the Miles Morales joint, the animated joint. that dropped just over 2 years ago now. Um, if you take a look and if you're familiar with his entire backstory, it's a it's a story that plays out with a guy that deals with the cost of bad decisions throughout. And if you just oppose that to his antagonist, who is within the Spider-Man universe, and that's Robbie Robertson, who works at the Daily Bugle with Peter and J. Jonah Jameson, you're looking at two people who came up in the same, that grew up in the same area, had the same background, but ultimately one being Robbie Robertson went one way, and the other being Tombstone, who went the other way. And what happens within their, within their lives as a result of the decisions that they continue to make. And although, of course, that's not necessarily a storyline, or Tombstone as a character is not someone who is prominent enough that you can feature him in a MCU, type of, and on top of that, he's more tied to going up against Daredevil and Spider-Man specifically versus the Avengers as a whole. I understand all of that, but along the lines of but I would love to see a movie, focused on him and what led him to become what he became, as almost like a tale, as a cautionary tale of when you make certain choices, there are going to be consequences. You got to be sound when it comes to the decisions that you make because of the impact that those decisions will have on you and others around you. So with a Tombstone type of, introduction into the MCU, would it work? No, it wouldn't. I'm being realistic here. But within a Logan, almost like the Joker that just came out, last year, in that type of space, with a Tombstone type of movie with some Spider-Man overtones work, it could. Again, I understand, and this is just me, just having that, if it could ever happen, I would love for it to happen, although I understand why it doesn't necessarily work and why it probably wouldn't. But this right here, just indulge me for a second, man. This is wishful thinking. So, that's just where I'm coming from with it. I would love to see something like that. MCU wise, yeah, Craven. Would love to see him. So, you know what, man? We've had, a good run of MCU movies. We had up and down on the X-Men side of things. I mean, X-Men 3.
Yeah. E- Every
Yeah,
other movie, like they say, y'all get every other movie right on the
right.
X Men
X-Men
side.
Apocalypse. You talk
Yeah,
about
that's
looking
why y'all
forward
messed
to it.
up with the Phoenix. Yeah, cause y'all was due for a good one, and they screwed it up.
They screwed it up, man. So on the X-Men side of things, not so much, but on the Marvel, cinematic, the MCU side of things, they've done a good job overall, no question. Looking forward to what they do, what we got coming up here over the next several years as we go into the next phase. So good stuff, man. And I'm glad we was able to, get together and do this. We've had these types of conversations previously, maybe, just on the one-on-one, but to bring this energy to champions material, man, I'm glad for that to happen. Now, you know, with that said, I want to thank my brother CJ for coming through again. Check him and his team out on their Villains and Vinyl podcast. Matter of fact, let the people out there know, man, everything that you got going on and everything that you and your team are working on.
Yeah, check us out. Definitely on appreciate that. Check us out. We're Villains and Vinyl. We're kind of a hip hop and geek culture podcast. We debate everything from hip hop in the beginning of the show, then we move on to nerd stuff. We have a separate show called VCW. That's pro
Mm.
wrestling. Yes, I know it's not a sport. I know it's fake. Don't come for me. All
Come
right.
on, man.
So, but we still talk about it. We do talk about hip hop on Villains and Vinyl. If you're not interested in the VCW stuff, Villains and
Right.
Vinyl, you're going to get our debates on best hip hop group ever. Outcast, by the way, there's no debate.
Oh. Ooh,
Don't
ooh,
come for me.
dang,
Don't
ooh,
come for me,
dang.
Wu Tang fans. Anyway, you don't come for me, Wu Tang fans. Not even close.
Come on.
But yeah, we do stuff like that. Talk about comics, storylines, video games as well. So stuff like that.
Yeah,
So
no
definitely
doubt.
check us out. We're on Apple, Spotify, Google. Um, yeah, pretty much wherever you get a podcast, we're on it.
Absolutely, man. And I've had a chance to dive in on more than, a few occasions. And I really love the balance of informed, content as far as what you all are talking about, but also just the balance between being informed, but also just straight up authenticity, conversational, and just basically just telling it like it is, man. So you guys are doing some great work over there. Definitely check out CJ and his team, the Villains and Vinyl podcast, as well as the VCW podcast on Google, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever podcasts are found. Look them up. You're welcome. All right. Appreciate all of you guys and ladies out there for taking the time to listen. Hopefully, myself and CJ provided you with some positive energy, something positive you can take away from today's podcast. As always, send any feedback you have over to champions.materialsv@gmail.com or leave a voicemail. Let us know what you think. The link is located at the bottom of the description for this episode. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. As always, check out the official Champions Material YouTube channel, where we post episodes and other select content. Like, subscribe, share, all that. And never forget, whoever you want to be and whatever you want to be, always be the champion of it. That's Champions Material. Everybody be safe. Stay tuned for our next episode, coming sooner than later. Hip Hop, Then and Now, Volume 1, the 90s. For now, everybody hold it down. And we're done.